Welcome to Treatise on Treaties. Episode 2. Compromising Westphalia. Last time, we talked about how and why states are formed and presented one specific theory for this. Today, as the title suggests, we will talk about the Westphalian Peace of 1648 and its effects on the concept of sovereignty. This will not be an entire series, as explaining the treaties that make up this peace agreement would take an entire podcast of its own, and it does not really add to our narrative. Today, however, we will discuss the main implications the treaty conveyed for the European system and take a peek at the scholarly discussion around that topic. Therefore, this episode is intended to supply the basic foundation for our analysis of the international political system and its theories. The Peace of Westphalia, to put it very, very simply, ended the 30 Years' War, a conflict fought between the Catholic Holy Roman Empire, its Catholic principalities, the Kingdom of Spain belonging to the same dynasty as the Catholic Emperor, House Habsburg, and the Protestant principalities of the Holy Roman Empire, the Kingdom of Sweden, the Kingdom of Denmark, and later, the Catholic Kingdom of France. With the entrance of France into the war, some argue that it had changed from a mostly intra-religious conflict into a mostly territorial conflict, as the Bourbon kings of France wanted to fight their main opponent in continental Europe, the House of Habsburg. This is condensed to the very limits of historical falsehood, what happened between 1618 and 1648. Many theorists of international relations have since, at least in part, argued that this war had been the struggle between universalism, the idea that all polities in Europe should put themselves under one authority, the one of the Church in Rome, and particularists, arguing that all polities had a right to manage their own affairs without any intervention from the outside, be it worldly or spiritual, imperial or ecclesiastical. The treaty also ended the 80 Years' War, which was fought between the Kingdom of Spain, also in Habsburg hands, and the United Provinces of the Netherlands, fighting for their independence from their Iberian overlords. With the emergence of Switzerland and the Netherlands, two very important new players in strong strategic positions had emerged, with the latter pretty quickly finding its way into the European system as a challenger to the other great maritime powers. The Austrian Habsburgs had to cede Alsace and Lorraine to France, which would, as you might know, be the subject of constant fighting between Germans and French for almost 300 years onward. Sweden, gaining large territories in northeastern Germany, also managed to secure the right to send delegates to the Reichstag, the assembly of the Reichsstände, the imperial estates, whose authority over imperial politics was greatly enhanced. The minority of Protestant princes in the assembly could not simply be ignored. If the Protestant princes decided, in unison, to block a measure to be enacted by the Emperor or the Reichstag, they had to be heard. The peace also suspended the practice of cuius regio, eius religio, binding the confession of subjects to the confession of their lord. People were allowed to practice their faith privately and publicly, even if it differed from the one of their lord. As such, power was, for the first time, being divided from religion, especially in Germany, as at least basic religious tolerance between Catholicism and Protestantism was formally achieved, although, as you might figure, this principle was far from universally accepted and practiced. This, of course, was a major blow to the Catholic Church, whose nominal dominance of the empire through the might of the emperor in majority Protestant principalities with Catholic rulers was now defeated. What is extremely important about this peace for our narrative, even more than the actual border changes, is the way it was concluded. as pretty much the first peace agreement in the history of Europe, the way to solve the conflict was debated and designed in a peace congress which actually started 5 years before the peace was concluded in 1648. Why is that so important? The Peace of Westphalia sets an important precedent as how to create a stable order after a peace agreement. It invited all sides, even the lowliest margrave, to the table, encouraged public and private debate at the bargaining table, at feasts, and in the quarters of the respective envoys. So, one could argue that via the acceptance of the aforementioned imperial estates to the negotiations was a major achievement, as all the dissenting voices, especially the Protestant ones, would be heard as to create a peace agreement that was binding and long-lasting. After a devastating war, one might argue as well, this conception of the idea of peace congresses was a brilliant idea. On the other hand, some scholars of international relations have made out the Peace of Westphalia as the birth of the concept of Westphalian sovereignty. Westphalian sovereignty is the idea of states being free from foreign intervention into their domain. This means that states have the sole authority over their domestic matters, and that this power is limited to their own borders. States are not allowed to directly influence the interior workings of another state, and no foreign power, like, for example, an emperor, is to interfere with the decisions of their rulers. Therefore, you could call the 30 Years' War a war that created states and reshaped European politics into a new form of system. The peace treaties, according to these scholars, tilted the balance in the Holy Roman Empire away from the central authority of the emperor and toward the princes of the empire. States, according to this train of thought, had to consider each other as equals, with the conclusion that they have inalienable rights that other states were not to infringe upon. Yet, obviously, those states still had to be able to defend their perceived interests. The right to make war is an integral point in the concept of Westphalian sovereignty and might be seen as not an intervention into other state affairs, but rather the ultimate way to settle any legal dispute that other measures were unable to solve. This system of sovereign states with the license to kill, if I may, creates a need for stable equilibrium, which is where we will touch off next week, when we are discussing 4 of the major theories of international relations. Still, this is what you could call the orthodox model of the creation of the sovereign state system. It has been argued, however, that this is a complete myth, and just been invented after the fact to explain something according to one special frame of mind. In 2001, Andreas Osiander published an article called Sovereignty, International Relations and the Westphalian Myth in the spring issue of International Organization. I would consider this text to be the best one in debating the concept of the Westphalian state, and therefore would like to present you his findings in a short, digestible manner. He argues that the model of sovereignty proposed as the Westphalian model is based on the aforementioned myth of the defense of particular sovereignty against encroaching universalism of church and empire. He argues that none of the foreign powers intervening in the war, especially not Sweden and most definitely not France, went to war against the concept of empire. France, indeed very much, tried to establish empire over the states of Western Germany, while aiming a good kick at the shins of the Habsburgs. Osiander argues that sovereignty, as we describe it, was a non-issue during the peace process, and that the Westphalian principles of territorial sovereignty and non-interference into domestic matters were simply not mentioned once anywhere in any of the treaties making up the peace agreement. He calls any mention of those principles as a fictional account of the settlement. He continues by saying that perpetuating this myth is plain and simply the continuation of anti-Habsburg propaganda from the times of the war itself. Implicitly, and this is just something I read out of the text, he accuses the inventors of this idea of not having read the treaty's actual text at all. From this point of view, the construction of the international system as the byproduct of one of the most important peace settlements of the time is a historical inaccuracy at best, and a terrible misconception with harrowing implications for the entire field of study at worst. Because arguing that the principalities of the empire popped into sovereign states when the plethora of treaties was signed can be debated thoroughly. Indeed, Osiander remarks that this fixation is a concept of how we conceive the history of statehood and the role of the Holy Roman Empire in Europe from our time. Since the middle to late 19th century, we have been thinking in the categories of states pretty much only. Whenever you hear people talk of polities, be it Roman, Byzantine, Rus, German or French from any given period of time, you will always hear them talking of states. The perpetuation of this construction makes it impossible to leave these categories. So, from our argument, one might say that after 1648 there was significantly less Holy Roman Empire, so this void must be filled with something. So, why can't it be sovereign states? The point here is, none of the peace treaties actually touched the prerogatives of the emperor as opposed to his subjects and nominal vassals. Instead, Osiander argues, the conception of the Holy Roman Empire remains not only completely unchanged, but, given the aforementioned basic religious freedom, actually in a better working order. The settlement had alleviated the institutional deadlock that the rivalry between Catholic and Protestant states had created. The Reichstag, the assembly of the princes and cities of the empire, remained largely untouched as well, if even expanded, and the emperor still had considerable weight to throw around and complete veto rights. Indeed, from 1663 onwards, it would remain in permanent session at all times in the city of Regensburg, and represent the imperial estates in both opposition and cooperation with the imperial throne. What the peace agreement did, however, reaffirm was the concept of Landeshoheit, defined by Johann Jakob Moser, one of the great Reichspublizisten, imperial publicists of the 17th century. If you would like to know more about this interesting era of inner German debate over sovereignty and the imperial constitution, just send me an email to treatiseontreaties@gmail.com. If enough people are interested, I would really enjoy creating a little special about the Reichspublizistik, especially the works of Samuel Pufendorf and Johann Stephan Pütter, as I have taken a pretty interesting course on this topic at university. Don't be shy. Anyways, Landeshoheit, according to Moser, was the right of the princes of the empire to, quote, command, to forbid, to decree, to undertake, or to omit anything that pertains to any ruler, inasmuch as their hands are not tied by the laws and traditions of the empire. Now, is that even Westphalian sovereignty anymore? One might argue it is not. Indeed, one might even argue that this sovereignty is very limited or compromised. In a groundbreaking article named Compromising Westphalia, published in International Security in 1995, Stephen D. Krasner points out that there has never been a golden age of the Westphalian state, inasmuch that in basically every time period since its perceived conception after 1648, major powers have interfered with the politics and internal affairs of states that ought to be sovereign, and sovereign states have, at least to some degree, given away parts of their sovereignty to either other states or, more recently, supranational organizations. These internal and external violations of sovereignty, he argues, are brought to pass in four ways: conventions, coercion, contracting, and imposition. And that, in fact, the interior machinations of a state are, and always have been, shaped by those four factors. Conventions, for starters, are being put into effect by rulers agreeing on inviolable principles that are not to be broken. The laws of warfare are a good example for that. Contracting, on the other hand, means that states are giving away parts of their sovereignty in exchange for benefits like minting rights in the Holy Roman Empire or trade laws in any time of history. Coercion is, pretty self-explanatory, the need to acquiesce to certain rules and changes in a state in fear of military or economic sanction. Imposition is the extreme version of that. While coercion can be, at least nominally, resisted, imposed violations of a state's sovereignty are being machinated by other actors against which resistance would be futile. Add in some binding imperial jurisdiction into this anti-sovereignty concoction, something we will not touch in depth this episode, but which will be of importance at some other point of our story, you've got, according to Osiander, a system that is actually pretty much a fully developed international system under the hegemony of one major power that wields considerable influence that, however, is checked by different institutions. Pretty advanced, right? If we spin this thought a little further, we might even say that this system was an international system before an international system was created, but, most importantly, it was not what we would call a Westphalian one. The political scientist Hedley Bull frames the order of things inside the empire as sovereign but belonging to a larger whole. A good term for understanding this complex system, and certainly a little more in depth than the original approach. Another thing he notes is that from 1648 on to 1815, the number of European states would decline continuously, which is another point that will deserve our attention down the line. To conclude, there are strong points to be made against the empirical basis of Westphalian sovereignty, as well as its functionality as even a guideline for any political theory. But, as we will see next week, there are at least two major theories that see Westphalian sovereignty as a core assumption that must not be violated or put into question. If we look at the European map and the European political system after 1648, one might still argue that the emperor, and especially the Holy See, had lost power. After the Battle of Rocroi in 1635, which was technically a part of another war, which we will mention in episodes to come, Spain had ceased to be one of the dominant land powers of Europe. Over the course of the war, the devastation and the emergence of powerful and more independent Protestant electors, whose rights were guaranteed by both France and Sweden, the emperor had lost influence over large parts of the Holy Roman Empire, which, given time, are going to rise up in arms against the Habsburgs once more, and even emerge to become the dominant powers in what we have come to know as Germany. For the first time in centuries, the power of the two big Catholic monarchies under Habsburg control had started to wane. So, what do we take out of this? It is a little hard to pinpoint the cause of this debate, or rather, what we should deduce from this ongoing discussion. For our purposes, we do still have to remember those facts. The empire and the authority of the Catholic Church have been challenged and, at least in some parts, defeated. And France, with its intervention into the conflict and the constant defeats of the Spanish in key battles, was on the rise. Whether sovereignty was one of the grand products of the Peace of Westphalia or not, we have to acknowledge that, for all intents and purposes, the political map of Europe had changed into a new state, and even though the peace was designed in the most cordial fashion possible, there still were many kings to be sorted out. For the first time in the history of Europe, peace was made with the long-term stability of the agreement and the system in mind. It would, however, take more war and more destruction until the concept of international stability and its active preservation would become enshrined in peace deals to come. When we come to discussing our first major treaty, the Peace of Utrecht, in 2 episodes' time, we will take a look at what happened between 1648 and 1701 in a little more detail, and we will see how the balance of power and the attempts to achieve it became institutionalized in 1713. The concept of peace through Congress and its establishment in the international system is vital for our analysis. With the new recognition of either Landeshoheit or sovereignty, whatever you may prefer, the minor states that were inevitably pulled into the wars of the major powers now had the possibility to preserve and further their own interests once the bloodletting had stopped. While this may sound like it would complicate the solving of the conflict, it did, however, allow for a better chance of solving a conflict in a stable and sustainable manner. The congresses themselves were vibrant social events, and we'll dive into them once we start exploring our narrative. Stay tuned. While from the 1950s onward, the concept of Westphalian sovereignty remained rather unchallenged in its perceived empirical correctness, over the course of the last 30 years, it has been attacked over and over again. Not only, as we have seen, has its foundation in history been put into question, but rather the concept of the state as the important unit of international politics has been debated. It is this debate over the relevance of the state that we will encounter again next time, when we take a look at 4 of the major systemic theories of international politics, namely neo-realism, liberalism, neoliberal institutionalism, and social constructivism.